I open with the sound, not the sight. A deep metallic groan rolls up from beneath the water like the earth itself is shifting, a slow grinding echo that vibrates through the wooden boards under my feet. My phone rattles across the deck table, screen lighting up again and again, message after message stacking faster than I can read. The water's dropping. Call me now. What did you do? I step outside and the morning air feels wrong, thinner somehow. The lake I have known my entire life is already lower than it was at sunrise, the wet shoreline exposed like a scar. Across the water, rows of polished rental cabins sit frozen in confusion, their floating docks hanging uselessly in midair. Families rush toward their cars, staff shout into radios. And at the far end of the peninsula, the HOA president stands pointing straight at me, fury written across his face. What none of them understand is simple. They built their entire fortune on land that was never theirs, on a lake that only exists because my family allowed it. And today, that permission ended. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline File Stories, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Months earlier, none of this noise existed. The lake was quiet in the way. Only places far from highways and cities can be quiet, the kind of silence that is not empty, but full of small natural sounds you only notice when everything else disappears. I had locked the cabin doors before winter, checked the shoreline one last time, and driven away believing I would return to the same untouched view I had known since childhood. My daughter had just given birth, and her husband was deployed overseas, so I packed my truck and went to help her for what I thought would be a few weeks. Weeks became months. Diapers, midnight feedings, grocery runs, and the soft rhythm of a newborn's breathing replaced the rustle of pine trees and the gentle slap of water against the dock. I did not resent it. Family had always come first in our home, and that lake would still be there when I returned. It always had been. The property was never just land to me. It was history you could walk on. My grandfather had bought the acreage long before developers ever cared about that valley. Back then, it was nothing but uneven hills and 3 narrow mountain creeks that swelled every spring and dried to trickles by late summer. He was an engineer, patient and stubborn, the kind of man who measured twice and built once. Instead of seeing useless terrain, he saw possibility. He designed and built a modest dam at the narrowest point where the creeks met, shaping the flow until a reservoir formed naturally behind it. Over the years, that reservoir became the lake I grew up swimming in, fishing in, and learning the quiet lessons that only solitude teaches. Every board in the cabin, every rock along the shoreline, carried fingerprints from people who came before me. When I left to help my daughter, I did not feel like I was abandoning property. I felt like I was stepping away from a living memory that would patiently wait for my return. The surrounding community had always been small, almost invisible on most maps, but it had begun to change. A few new houses appeared on distant ridges. Roads were widened. Mailboxes multiplied along the highway. With growth came organization, and with organization came the Homeowners Association. At first, the HOA was little more than a name printed at the bottom of newsletters slipped into mailboxes. They talked about beautification projects, shared trash collection schedules, and seasonal safety reminders. I rarely attended meetings. My land sat outside their official boundaries, and my interactions with them were minimal. Once or twice I received politely worded letters suggesting that I consider joining for community cohesion. I ignored them without hostility. It felt optional, distant, something that belonged to other people's lives rather than mine. Neighbors would occasionally mention the HOA president in passing, usually with a shrug or a half smile. Some described him as ambitious, others as overly enthusiastic. No one spoke with anger, but there was a consistent undertone of caution, like people discussing a storm cloud they had learned to live around. I remember one evening at the local hardware store, when 2 residents debated whether the new parking rules were fair. It sounded trivial, the kind of community friction that never truly reaches you if you live a little farther out. At the time, it barely registered in my mind. My world was the lake, the cabin, the stretch of forest where deer moved at dusk. Bureaucracy felt like something that happened elsewhere. Even during my months away, I received a handful of HOA emails forwarded by a neighbor who thought I might want to stay informed. They mentioned development proposals and zoning discussions, nothing that appeared urgent. I skimmed them late at night while rocking my granddaughter to sleep, the glow of the phone screen reflecting in the dark living room. The words felt abstract, disconnected from the scent of pine and the feel of cold lake water I carried in my memory. I assumed whatever changes were happening would remain small and controlled, the natural evolution of a growing area. I had no reason to suspect that those bland bullet points concealed anything significant. When I finally began the drive back months later, I felt relief more than anticipation. The road curved through familiar mountain passes, and with each mile the air seemed clearer. I rolled down the window and let the scent of wet earth and evergreen fill the truck. I expected to see the same skyline I had always seen. Tree lines hugging the water, the occasional fishing boat, nothing more. As I turned onto the last gravel stretch leading to the cabin, everything looked exactly as I remembered. The forest stood unchanged. The hills were steady silhouettes against the sky. For a moment, I felt foolish for ever worrying that time away could alter something so permanent. Then, just before the final bend, something sharp and geometric broke the natural line of the horizon. At first I thought it was sunlight hitting a metal roof at the wrong angle. But as the truck rolled forward, one roof became two, then several. Clean edges, where there should have been treetops. Straight lines where only curves of shoreline used to exist. I slowed without realizing it, my foot easing off the accelerator as more unfamiliar shapes revealed themselves along the distant water. They were too uniform, too deliberate to be private cabins built quietly over time. They looked planned, organized, commercial. The closer I drove, the more those rooftops multiplied, spreading along the far shore like a reflection that did not belong to the lake at all. That was the moment the unease settled in, heavy and unmistakable. The valley was still quiet, the wind still moving through the pines, but something fundamental had shifted. From a distance, the lake no longer looked untouched. It looked claimed. I did not go inside the cabin when I arrived. I dropped my bags by the door, grabbed the old binoculars from the kitchen shelf, and walked straight back onto the deck. From that distance, the rooftops still looked unreal, like a mirage formed by light and angle. But when I raised the lenses to my eyes, the illusion shattered. Clean wooden decks, uniform railings, glass windows reflecting the water, people carrying suitcases. It was not one or two cabins tucked discreetly into the trees. It was rows. Organized, symmetrical, deliberate. My stomach tightened before my mind even caught up. I took the truck and drove the perimeter road, the narrow dirt loop that traced the boundaries of my land. That road had always been empty except for the occasional ranger or lost hiker. Now I passed freshly paved turn-ins, gravel parking areas, and wooden signposts pointing toward things that had never existed before. Lakeview rentals, sunrise cabins, private dock access. The words private and Lakeview felt like insults printed in polished paint. Every bend in the road revealed more structures, more paths cut through trees, more evidence that this was not a recent intrusion. This had taken planning, permits, crews, and months of work. No one builds something this large by accident. By the time I completed the loop, I had counted 110 cabins. Not estimates, not guesses. 110 identical structures aligned along my shoreline like someone had stamped them from a mold. Floating docks extended into the water. Kayaks were stacked in neat rows. Families walked along paved paths carrying towels and coolers. It looked like a vacation brochure had been dropped onto land that had never asked for it. I parked near a small wooden building marked Welcome Center and stepped inside, still trying to convince myself there had to be some misunderstanding. The young woman behind the counter smiled the rehearsed smile of someone used to greeting guests. She handed me a brochure before I even spoke. It listed nightly rates that made my eyebrows rise and described exclusive access to Whitmore Lake. My lake. My family name printed in bold letters above glossy photographs I had never approved. When I told her I was the property owner, her smile faltered, confusion replacing confidence. She flipped through papers, called a supervisor who never answered, and finally repeated what she had clearly been instructed to say. The shoreline, she explained, was public. The lake was recreational territory. The development was part of a homeowners association expansion approved months earlier. She said it as if repeating a memorized script, not a fact she truly understood. I walked back outside with the brochure still in my hand. anger replacing disbelief like heat replacing cold. I called my attorney from the driver's seat, my voice steadier than I felt. Within hours, we were reviewing digital deed maps and survey overlays. Lines appeared on the screen, clean and undeniable. Every single cabin, every dock, every paved path fell inside my property boundary. Some of them were not even close to the edge. They were deep within land that had been legally documented for decades. There was no gray area, no technical loophole, just trespass on a massive scale. A neighbor I had known for years drove up while I sat there staring at the maps. He looked uneasy, glancing toward the cabins like they might hear him. He admitted he had assumed I had sold part of the shoreline. Everyone had. The construction had started slowly, then accelerated, and once the rentals began, people stopped asking questions. He warned me that the HOA president was aggressive, that challenging him publicly rarely ended well. His concern felt genuine, but it also carried resignation, the tone of someone who had learned not to push back. I did push back. I arranged a meeting that same evening at the clubhouse perched on the hill overlooking the water. The man who finally introduced himself as the HOA president did not appear flustered or apologetic. He was polished, smiling, and entirely certain of his position. He spoke about community growth, tourism benefits, shared resources. When I mentioned property deeds and boundary lines, he waved a hand as if I were pointing out a minor clerical error. The lake, he insisted, was a public recreational asset. The shoreline, he claimed, fell under county jurisdiction. His confidence was not loud, but it was immovable, like someone standing on ground he believed could not shift beneath him. I tried calm reasoning. I showed him copies of surveys. I explained the history of the dam, the legal documentation, the decades of continuous ownership. He listened with the patience of someone humoring a complaint rather than addressing a fact. Then he smiled again, thinner this time, and mentioned litigation costs. Years in court. Deep pockets. Investors. He laughed lightly, not cruelly, just dismissively, as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere I could not see. When I said the cabins were on my land, he responded with a phrase that echoed long after the meeting ended. Then prove it in court. As I stepped outside, the lights from the cabins shimmered across the water, reflections multiplying in the dark. Behind me, through the clubhouse windows, he was still talking, still smiling. The message was clear. He did not intend to move a single board. And he fully expected me to drown in paperwork before I ever moved him. The first envelope arrived 2 days after the meeting, thick white paper with the HOA logo stamped in blue like an official seal of authority. Inside was a formal notice accusing me of zoning violations on my own property. The language was clinical, confident, filled with references to ordinances and compliance deadlines. I read it twice, then a third time, half expecting the words to rearrange themselves into something reasonable. They did not. According to the letter, my dock was improperly positioned, my shoreline vegetation was unmanaged, and my dam operations required community oversight. Community oversight. The phrase lingered in my head like a bad taste. By the end of that week, 2 more envelopes appeared, each more aggressive than the last, each insisting I correct problems that did not exist. The pressure did not stay on paper. Guests began appearing at my gate, polite at first, then irritated, then openly hostile. They had paid for what they believed was exclusive lake access, and the rumors circulating online blamed me for every inconvenience they experienced. When the water level shifted even slightly after a routine rainfall adjustment, messages flooded local forums accusing me of sabotage. I found strangers standing on the dirt road pointing at the cabin, taking photos, whispering as if I were a tourist attraction gone wrong. One family demanded refunds as if I were the resort manager. Another accused me of destroying their anniversary trip. None of them knew the truth, and none of them wanted to hear it. Unannounced visits followed. HOA representatives arrived in branded polos and clipboards, claiming they needed to inspect shoreline compliance. They walked my land without permission, stepping over rocks my grandfather had placed decades earlier, measuring distances as if my property were a shared hallway. When I asked them to leave, they reminded me that cooperation was in everyone's best interest. Their smiles were rehearsed, their politeness edged with threat. I installed cameras, not out of paranoia but necessity, and even then the sense of intrusion never fully left. Every vehicle that slowed near the driveway made my shoulders tighten. Sleep became fractured. I would wake at small noises, convinced someone was outside. My phone lit up at all hours with notifications from local groups debating my character as if I were a public figure. Words like selfish and obstructionist appeared again and again. The narrative shifted quickly, efficiently, like a campaign already planned. I was no longer the quiet landowner on the edge of the valley. I was the man standing in the way of progress, the obstacle to community growth. Friends called with cautious voices, advising compromise. Maybe sell a portion, maybe negotiate shared access. Their intentions were kind, but each suggestion felt like a small surrender carved from something I had spent a lifetime protecting. I attended an HOA meeting, hoping logic might still have a place there. The room was crowded, folding chairs lined in rows beneath bright fluorescent lights. When I stood to speak, the murmurs began before my first sentence ended. I laid out survey maps, explained boundaries, described the history of the dam. A few faces showed uncertainty, but most showed impatience. The HOA president spoke after me, smooth and charismatic, framing the issue as collective benefit versus individual stubbornness. Applause followed his words. When the vote came to continue development operations, hands rose almost unanimously. Mine was the only one that stayed down. The sound of those raised hands moving through the air felt heavier than any shout. After that meeting, the letters intensified. Fines were threatened. Deadlines shortened. Legal language thickened until it resembled a wall rather than communication. The antagonist grew more visible online, posting updates about community unity and shared prosperity, carefully omitting my name while making it clear who the villain was supposed to be. Neighbors who once waved from their porches now offered tight nods or avoided eye contact entirely. The isolation was not loud, but it was constant, like a low hum you could never switch off. Then the final notice arrived, delivered by certified mail, requiring a signature. Inside was a legal motion filed with the county requesting restrictions on my dam access for environmental safety and community stability. The phrasing was strategic, almost benevolent on the surface, but the intent was unmistakable. If granted, it would place my own infrastructure under external control. I sat at the kitchen table reading the document while the evening light faded across the lake, the cabins glowing in the distance like a second shoreline I never agreed to. For the first time since returning, the weight of it all pressed down hard enough to steal my breath. It was no longer just harassment or public opinion. It was an attempt to legally box me into silence, to turn ownership into permission granted by others. And as I folded the papers closed, I understood something with absolute clarity. They were not trying to negotiate. They were trying to suffocate. The turning point did not arrive with a phone call or a dramatic confrontation. It arrived quietly, late at night, with a stack of old binders spread across my dining table and the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the room. I had not opened those binders in years. They smelled faintly of dust and lake water, the paper edges slightly curled from decades of storage. Inside were blueprints, inspection logs, permits, and handwritten notes from my grandfather's careful engineering mind. Lines intersected across diagrams of concrete, steel, and flow rates. Numbers marched in neat columns describing water pressure and spillway capacity. It was all familiar, but I had been looking at it from memory before. That night, I looked at it for leverage. The legal motion the HOA filed to restrict my dam access sat beside the blueprints like an accusation. They were trying to put a leash on something they did not own, something they barely understood. As I read through the original permits again, then the updated county filings, then the water management renewals, a simple truth emerged with startling clarity. The dam was not community infrastructure. It was private infrastructure. My infrastructure. Every renewal bore my family's name. Every inspection certificate confirmed operational authority remained exclusively with the property owner. There was no clause, no hidden paragraph granting outside control. I had never needed it before, so I had never considered what it truly meant. Now it felt like discovering a key that had been in my pocket the entire time. I called an old colleague the next morning. a civil engineer who had spent years consulting on reservoir systems across the state. He answered with the same calm tone I remembered from long project days, and when I explained the situation, there was a pause before he spoke again. Not hesitation, consideration. He asked about structural condition, gate integrity, downstream rights. His questions were precise, technical, unemotional. When I told him the last full inspection had been years earlier, he made a low sound of agreement. Then a maintenance drawdown is not only feasible, he said, it's reasonable. The phrase settled into my mind like a weight placed exactly where it needed to be. Not revenge, not sabotage. Maintenance. Lawful, documented, defensible. The realization shifted something inside me that weeks of confrontation had not. I had been thinking like a defendant, reacting to letters and accusations, trying to prove ownership in rooms filled with raised hands and rehearsed speeches. But the dam changed the entire equation. I did not need to argue with a single cabin owner. I did not need to negotiate dock placements or zoning interpretations. The resort's value did not come from the wood of its cabins or the polish of its welcome center. It came from the water. Without the lake at its current level, the word lakefront became meaningless. The empire they had built rested on a feature they did not control and had never bothered to understand. Frustration cooled into focus. I began documenting everything with deliberate care. Photographs of shoreline encroachments. Copies of rental advertisements using my lake's name. Emails from HOA representatives acknowledging uncertainty about property lines. I scheduled consultations with county water officials, framing each conversation around structural safety and inspection necessity. No anger. No threats, just procedure. Each confirmation added another layer of legitimacy to what I already knew I could do. The tone of my days changed. The late-night anxiety that once kept me pacing the floor was replaced by long, quiet hours of planning, reading, and cross-checking details. I was no longer cornered. I was calculating. Even my attorney noticed the shift. Our conversations moved from defensive strategies to logistical timelines. We discussed notification requirements, environmental assessments, and downstream impact reports. Every step was documented, every form filed. The process was not rushed because it did not need to be. The strength of it lay in its patience. I did not have to prove they were wrong in front of a crowd. I only had to follow the law more carefully than they ever had. There was a strange calm in the days leading up to the decision. The cabin still buzzed with activity. Guests still laughed on decks they believed permanent. The HOA president continued posting confident updates about community unity. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, everything had. The power dynamic had shifted without a single raised voice. They were still pushing against my walls, unaware that the ground beneath their feet was about to lower itself. When the final confirmation came through from the county office, stamped and dated, I held the paper for a long moment before setting it down. Structural inspection authorization. Gate operation permitted under maintenance protocol. It was not dramatic. It was not emotional. It was simply official. That simplicity made it stronger than any argument I could have delivered in the meeting hall. I drove to the dam before sunrise the next day. The air was cold, the valley still wrapped in the quiet blue of early morning. Steel mechanisms stood exactly where they had stood for decades, unchanged, patient. I placed my hand on the control wheel and felt the weight of generations in the metal. This was not destruction. This was stewardship, a responsibility exercised, not a weapon drawn. I began the turn slowly, listening to the low mechanical groan echo into the valley. For the first time since returning home, I did not feel anger or fear. I felt certainty. The cabins remained untouched. The shoreline remained intact. But the lake, the one thing they had built their entire business upon, was no longer theirs to assume. As the gates shifted and the water began its gradual descent, the message was not shouted. It was demonstrated. And in that quiet, deliberate motion, the balance of power flipped completely. I did not announce anything. There was no public statement, no dramatic post, no warning shot fired across the valley. Everything moved through paperwork and quiet appointments, the kind that never make headlines but change outcomes. I filed maintenance notices with the county water office using the same language engineers have used for decades: structural inspection, sediment evaluation, flow regulation. Each form was stamped, logged, and returned with official acknowledgement. Nothing in those documents mentioned cabins or resorts or conflict. They spoke only of steel gates, pressure tolerances, and safety compliance. On the surface, it looked like routine maintenance. Underneath, it was positioning. I installed additional cameras along the shoreline and near the access road, not to intimidate anyone but to document movement. The small red indicator lights blinked at night like distant fireflies, silent witnesses to everything that unfolded. Footsteps on private paths. Unauthorized vehicles. Conversations carried by the wind. I kept meticulous timestamps. Each recording was labeled and backed up. The act of documenting steadied my mind. It turned chaos into data, anger into evidence. I was no longer reacting to accusations. I was collecting facts that would outlast them. Allies appeared not through loyalty, but through procedure. A county official visited the dam under the pretense of verifying inspection scheduling. He walked the perimeter with a clipboard, asking neutral questions, nodding at the structural condition. His final statement was simple and decisive. Operational authority remained solely with the property owner. An environmental inspector followed days later, testing downstream clarity and confirming that a controlled drawdown for maintenance posed no regulatory violation. Neither man offered opinions about the resort or the HOA. They did not need to. Their confirmations were stronger than opinions. They were records, and records do not raise their voices. The water began to drop slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. The difference between one morning and the next was measured in inches, not feet. Only those who lived by the shoreline noticed immediately. Floating docks adjusted awkwardly. Boat ladders reached a little farther than they had before. The lake did not vanish. It simply shifted, like a breath drawn in reverse. Online, the first complaints appeared in travel forums. Guests mentioned low water levels and unexpected shoreline conditions. Reviews lost their sparkle. The change was subtle enough to avoid panic but steady enough to create doubt. The HOA president grew attentive but not alarmed. I saw his vehicle pass the perimeter road more frequently, slowing near the dam access point, then continuing on. His public messages remained confident, framed around seasonal fluctuations and natural cycles. He assumed I would stop, that this was a temporary adjustment, a minor inconvenience I would eventually reverse. Overconfidence is quiet. It does not shout. It relaxes its grip just enough to overlook the small moves that matter. Meanwhile, I gathered everything: copies of rental advertisements using my lake's name, emails from HOA representatives acknowledging assumed boundaries, recordings of shoreline trespass labeled with dates and times, legal correspondence confirming inspection rights. The folders on my desk multiplied, each one a piece of a larger picture that no longer relied on emotion. The resort's bookings began to thin. Weekends that once filled instantly showed open slots. The welcome center shortened its hours. None of this happened overnight. It unfolded like a slow tide retreating, revealing stones that had always been there but had never been visible. The atmosphere felt less like a feud and more like a chess match played across water and paper. Every move I made was deliberate, recorded, and lawful. Every move they made became part of the record. I did not need to confront them publicly. The numbers did that for me. Empty reservations. Refund requests. Customer questions that staff could not answer without guessing. The cabins still stood, polished and intact, but their value depended on an image that was quietly dissolving. Then the announcement came. A formal notice circulated through the community channels declaring an emergency HOA meeting. The agenda was brief and pointed: a vote to petition the county to legally compel restoration of water levels in the shared recreational reservoir. The phrasing was careful, designed to sound collective and reasonable. Beneath it was urgency. They could feel the shift now, even if they could not fully explain it. I read the notice twice, then set it beside the growing stack of evidence on my desk. That evening, I finalized my preparations. Every document was copied and indexed. every recording backed up in multiple locations. My attorney confirmed attendance and legal standing. The dam logs were printed, signed, and dated. Outside, the lake reflected the fading light with a slightly altered shoreline, subtle but undeniable. Inside, the folders closed with a soft thud that sounded less like paperwork and more like a door locking into place. The vote they were planning would not corner me. It would gather them all in one room, under one roof, at the exact moment my evidence was ready. The days leading up to the meeting moved with a strange distortion of time, each hour stretching longer than it should, each night passing too quickly to feel restful. The valley itself seemed to sense the tension. Boats were fewer on the water. The docks creaked in the evenings like unsettled bones. Every trip into town carried the same weight of sideways glances and half-finished conversations that died when I entered a room. People were not just curious anymore. They were choosing sides without saying the words out loud. By the afternoon of the meeting, the parking lot outside the community hall was already filling. Trucks, sedans, rental vans with the resort's logo, even vehicles I recognized from the shoreline cabins. Investors had come. So had families who believed their vacations were being stolen from them, 1 inch of water at a time. The air buzzed with low conversations and quick gestures, hands cutting through the air like invisible arguments already in progress. I stepped out of my truck carrying 2 binders under one arm and a slim leather folder in my hand. On the outside, I moved slowly, deliberately. On the inside, my pulse beat like a second clock. I could not silence. Inside the hall, rows of folding chairs faced a small raised platform where the HOA board sat behind a long table. The HOA president stood near the center, shaking hands, leaning in close when he spoke, projecting calm confidence to anyone who would listen. He did not look at me immediately. That was part of the performance. When he finally did, the smile he offered was thin and practiced, a courtesy meant for witnesses rather than sincerity. I took a seat near the aisle, set the binders beside my chair, and watched the room fill until there was barely standing space left along the walls. Whispers moved like wind through dry leaves. I caught fragments of sentences. He's ruining everything. My rental income is gone. This is personal for him. Each word floated past me without landing. The binders at my feet felt heavier than paper should feel, as if the weight came from what they represented rather than their contents. Survey maps, permits, inspection logs, emails printed in black and white that removed tone and left only fact. I did not open them. Not yet. The moment had to be exact. When the meeting began, the HOA president spoke first. His voice filled the room with practiced authority, polished phrases about community well-being, and shared resources rolling easily from his tongue. He framed the falling water as an attack, a unilateral act that endangered livelihoods and damaged reputations. He spoke of families losing income, of local businesses suffering, of unity threatened by one individual's refusal to cooperate. Each sentence was met with nods and scattered applause. I listened without interruption, letting the narrative build around me like a wall they believed I could not climb. Then came the accusations, direct and public. He turned toward me, extending a hand as if presenting evidence when all he offered were words. He called my actions reckless. He suggested personal vendettas. He implied negligence disguised as maintenance. The room shifted with him, eyes following his gestures, expressions hardening. A few neighbors I had known for years avoided my gaze entirely. Others stared openly, waiting for a reaction that did not come. I kept my hands folded, breathing slow, measuring the rhythm of the room rather than the sting of his claims. Questions from the audience followed, some angry, some desperate. Investors demanded timelines. Cabin owners asked whether refunds would ever end. The HOA president answered each one with confidence, redirecting blame back toward me with subtle precision. I felt the pressure rise, the emotional temperature climbing with every exchange. Still, I said nothing. The binders remained closed. The leather folder stayed on my lap, untouched. Silence, in that moment, was louder than any rebuttal. It let their certainty stretch just a little too far. The atmosphere thickened until even the fluorescent light seemed harsh. Every cough echoed. Every chair scrape sounded like a warning. I could feel the room reaching a collective conclusion, the tide turning not because of evidence but because of repetition. That was the point. They needed agreement, not truth. The HOA president sensed it too. His posture straightened, his voice gained an edge of triumph. He announced the next item on the agenda with deliberate emphasis: a binding community vote to petition the county to suspend my operational rights over the dam until fair water levels were restored. Ballots were passed down the rows. Pens clicked open. Heads leaned together in whispered consultations. The decision was already forming before ink touched paper. I watched it unfold with a calm that surprised even me, the steady certainty I had found weeks earlier settling back into place. When the HOA president called for final comments before the vote, his gaze returned to me, confident now, almost amused. He believed the room was his. I rose slowly, the scrape of my chair drawing more attention than any raised voice could have. Conversations fell away in waves. I did not reach for the binders. I left them where they were. Instead, I lifted the single leather folder from my lap and held it at my side. The room went quiet enough that I could hear the faint hum of the air vents overhead. Dozens of eyes fixed on the thin line of stitched leather in my hand, expecting a speech, an argument, a plea. I offered none of those. I simply took one step forward, opened the folder, and prepared to place it on the table where every raised hand could see what they had overlooked. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The leather folder made a soft sound when it touched the table, but in the silence that had fallen over the room, it echoed louder than any gavel. I opened it slowly, turning it so the documents faced outward rather than toward me. The first sheet was a survey map, crisp, black boundary lines cutting through the shoreline with mathematical certainty. The cabins, the docks, the paved paths, every single structure, sat inside those lines. Not near them, inside them. I slid the next page forward, a certified deed record stamped and dated years before the first nail of the resort had ever been hammered. Murmurs began immediately, low and uncertain, like wind shifting direction. The HOA president leaned forward, his smile still present but thinner now, stretched like paper under tension. He reached for the survey as if proximity might weaken it. I placed another document beside it before his fingers could close. Engineering permits confirming the dam's private ownership and operational authority. The language was dense but unmistakable. The room did not need to understand every technical term. They only needed to see the official seals, the signatures, the dates. Confidence began to drain from the platform, the same way the water had been draining from the lake. Slowly at first, then all at once. I pressed a small recorder on the table and tapped it once. The click was sharp. A familiar voice filled the speakers, clear and unedited. It was one of the HOA representatives, recorded weeks earlier during an unguarded conversation. "We're not actually sure where the property line falls," the voice admitted, followed by nervous laughter. Another clip followed, another acknowledgement of uncertainty, another moment where assumption replaced verification. Faces in the audience shifted from anger to confusion. Investors looked at one another, eyes narrowing as realization began to replace indignation. The narrative that had been repeated so confidently for months started to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. The first legal official stepped forward from the side of the room, then another. They had been standing quietly near the back, unnoticed until the evidence made their presence relevant. Their badges caught the overhead light. Papers were exchanged on the platform with professional efficiency. The HOA president tried to speak, but his words tangled, losing their rhythm. He pointed at me, then at the documents, then back at the crowd, as if searching for a version of the story that still held. There was none left. Voices rose from the audience, no longer directed at me but at him. Investors demanded explanations. Cabin owners asked who had verified the land before construction. Someone shouted about life savings. Another accused the board of negligence. The room heated quickly, anger shifting targets with startling speed. A man in the second row stepped forward too fast, his chair clattering behind him, and for a moment it looked like the confrontation might turn physical. Two officials moved between them, calm but firm, hands raised just enough to remind everyone that this had moved beyond debate. The vote ballots lay forgotten on laps and floors. No one was counting hands anymore. The meeting had dissolved into something raw and immediate. the illusion of unity shattered by the simple presence of documented truth. The HOA president's posture changed completely. The confident lean was gone, replaced by a rigid stillness, shoulders drawn inward as if he were shrinking from the evidence spread before him. When the enforcement officer read the preliminary notice aloud, unauthorized commercial construction on private property, immediate cessation of operations pending removal, the words landed like final notes in a long argument that no longer needed rebuttal. Shock rippled through the room in visible waves. People who had arrived ready to condemn me now stared at the platform in stunned silence. The hostility that had filled the air earlier drained away, replaced by disbelief and, in some faces, quiet embarrassment. The documents did not shout. They did not argue. They simply existed, and in their existence they erased months of accusation in minutes. Outside, the lake remained low, the exposed shoreline visible through the hall's windows like a quiet witness to everything unfolding inside. The resort lights across the water flickered on as dusk settled, but their glow looked different now, less like prosperity and more like something already fading. Officials handed over printed enforcement notices. Signatures were requested and given. A demolition order was drafted with efficient precision, its language formal and irreversible. No one applauded. There was no celebration. Only the heavy exhale of a crowd realizing the ground beneath them had shifted. When the final document was signed on the platform, the sound of the pen moving across paper felt louder than the earlier applause had ever been. The cabins still stood in the distance, but their future had already been decided. The lake had not risen, and the resort had not fallen by force. It had been undone by the simple act of proving what should have been known from the beginning. The dismantling did not happen overnight. It began with the Welcome Center, the symbolic heart of the whole operation. One morning it simply stood surrounded by orange fencing and quiet workers in reflective vests, and by evening its windows were gone, its doors stacked against a trailer, its polished sign lying face down in the dirt. After that, the cabins followed in sequence, one after another, like pieces being removed from a board that had been set up on the wrong table from the start. The noise of construction that once filled the shoreline returned, but this time it sounded different. Less ambitious, more corrective. Environmental crews arrived with seed spreaders and soil testers, walking the land with careful attention instead of hurried efficiency. They reseeded patches where grass had been flattened by foundations, replaced uprooted shrubs, and mapped erosion lines as if they were healing something rather than building it. From a distance, the shoreline slowly lost its sharp edges. The straight line softened. The artificial order gave way to the uneven textures of nature reclaiming space that had always been hers. It was not instant, but it was steady, and steadiness felt more honest than speed ever could. The HOA itself began to unravel in quieter ways. Leadership resignations appeared online in short, formal statements. Lawsuits multiplied, investors turning on the very board they had once defended. Meetings were canceled. Committees dissolved. The confident announcements that once filled community forums were replaced by legal disclaimers and silence. No single moment marked the end. It simply thinned until there was nothing left holding it together. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid conversation began stopping by again. Some offered apologies wrapped in small talk. Others simply nodded with a new kind of respect, the unspoken acknowledgement that the truth had been there all along. I did not ask for apologies. I did not need them. Their quiet gratitude felt more genuine than any public statement would have been. The valley's social rhythm returned slowly, like a clock reset after running fast for too long. Months later, when the last inspection reports were filed and the shoreline grasses had taken root, I drove back to the dam before sunrise. The metal wheel was cool under my palm, unchanged from the day I had first turned it in the opposite direction. Closing the gates was not dramatic. It was deliberate, measured, the same steady motion reversed. Over the following weeks, the water rose inch by inch, filling the exposed edges until the lake regained its familiar shape. Watching it return felt like watching a slow breath drawn back into a body that had held it too long. The cost of it all lingered. The sleepless nights, the strain on friendships, the weight of being misunderstood. But so did the lesson. Ownership is not loud. It is not proven by anger or force. It is proven by patience, documentation, and the willingness to stand still when others demand you move. Peace returned, not with applause or victory banners, but with quiet mornings on the dock and the sound of water against wood. It was not triumphant. It was earned, and that made it real. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline File Stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?